Hello. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Mira Blaustein. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Woodstock Film Festival. And it gives me such great pleasure to welcome you. You're about to listen to a conversation between director Rachel Grady, who is an Academy Award nominated filmmaker and a veteran in the documentary film world and a good friend of the Woodstock Film Festival, and two filmmakers, James Reed and Pippa Ehrlich. They are nominated with their film My Octopus Teacher in this year's Oscars. And I hope that you out there in the audience have all had a chance to see the film, because it really is one of the best films I've seen this year. And I, for one, really am looking forward to listen to the conversation between Rachel, James, and Pippa and learn about the making of this incredible film. So without further ado now, Rachel, James, and Pippa, could you join me, please? Hello, Pippa, how are you?
Hi, Mara. Thank you for having us.
And James, how are you? And
Hi, how you doing?
Before I introduce Rachel, I just want to, you guys are speaking to us from South Africa, correct? Rachel
Yes.
and Pippa?
Oh, no, I'm in Brooklyn.
No, I mean, I'm sorry. Pippa and James. Pippa, where are you?
I'm in Cape Town, South Africa.
And James?
I'm in Uganda.
Uganda, okay. And Rachel, I know you're in Brooklyn. So great to see all of you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So without further ado, James and Pippa, I'm leaving you in very competent hands of Rachel Grady. Rachel, take it away.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Hi. So I'm very excited to get to talk to you. The film stuck with me so much. I actually watched it on an airplane, and so it made it even more otherworldly, because you know when you watch stuff on a plane, you're transmitted to somewhere else anyway. So felt like I was in the air and the ocean and someone's mind and all these things, and it was really, really special, and it made me disappear from the hard world that we're living in right now in a really great way. So I have a lot of questions for you, but I'm going to ask you just sort of the first question is just the genesis story, which I know everyone always wants to know, which is how you met Craig and how you were able to hitch on to his ride for this that turned into the film.
I think that's maybe the most appropriate way I've heard it described, because it does feel like we hitched onto a ride that was already in full momentum by the time we were invited to get involved, and we're both very, very grateful to Craig for that. I met him through a mutual friend who was telling me about these amazing dives that he was having in the kelp forest, and he was going with this guy called Craig, and they weren't wearing wetsuits, and they were having these incredible experiences. And I'd been diving in the kelp forest actually for a long time, but I was curious and nervous, and I went out and I had no wetsuit on, and I expected to be very uncomfortable. And my mind was just absolutely blown, because I realized within the first 10, 15 minutes of, following Craig, even just following him along the beach before we got into the water, I saw he was able to read that environment like a book. He could see signs and find animals. It was like a language that he was interpreting, and it just absolutely fascinated me. And sometime later, I went back to him, and I was very interested in adapting my body to the cold, because I'd heard a lot about the benefits of that and how it changes the way your brain works and the way your body works. And I wanted to learn to track underwater, because what I'd seen him do had just made such an impression on me. And yeah, we started diving together. It took about 3 months for me to get the cold adaptation right. And the first animal he taught me to track was an octopus. What I didn't know too much about at that stage was this incredible experience he'd had with the octopus. And and I think he didn't talk about it too much. Only his wife, his son, and his good friend Roger Horrocks, who filmed a lot of the blue chip stuff that you see in my Octopus Teacher, those are the only humans who got to meet her. So I felt very, very lucky about 6 months into these dives with Craig, where he sat me down and he said, "Oh, I'm going to make another film, and I've told you bits, but this is the story of me and the year I spent with the octopus, and she completely changed my life. And would you like to help me make this film?" And when I read the treatment, I just started crying. And it was a scary decision because we had no budget. We were going to edit it in Craig's attic. We had piles and piles of footage shot on every different camera format you can imagine. And we just started working away. And when we started going through the footage and you see images of octopuses climbing onto sharks' backs to get away from their teeth and playing with fish and getting visibly frustrated because they can't catch a lobster, you just fall in love with what you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, I was just thinking. So he was your teacher, in a way.
He
right?
was in a way.
He was your teacher, and then he said, "I want to teach you about my teacher."
Exactly. That's exactly what happened. I want to teach you about my teacher, and he knew I'd never made a film before. I'd made a lot of short films. No, this was my first film.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so I was a marine science journalist. So I've been writing about nature and about the ocean for a long time, and been editing, short things. But to have an opportunity to work on something like this, there was just no way that I could ever have said no. And him and I worked for about 18 months, maybe just over. And during that process, our production partners off the fence came on board, and our EP Ellen Windermith got involved. And we got the film to a point where we had a story that we were very excited about, and that elicited strong emotional responses from people who watched it. So we knew we had something special. But there was something in the voice of it that just wasn't quite right. We were working with a script which Craig was reading, and he appeared on camera, but he never spoke to camera.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something in that just didn't work the way that we needed it to, and wasn't quite doing the story justice. And then our executive producer, Ellen Windermith, had a very clever idea, and she thought of James Reed, who's got this amazing interview-driven storytelling technique, and he's made a number of films like that. He's a very talented and experienced natural history filmmaker, and Ellen got the film in front of him.
And then what did you do, James?
By the way, that's you. Yeah, so it's amazing. So yeah, ahead of an email with a link containing the version of the film that Pip was talking about, I had no knowledge or experience of any of these.
Sorry.
I've got you, Pippa, but I don't have Rachel.
She's back.
She's
back. Hi.
She was just really still. So I had absolutely no knowledge of anything about this at all, and it happened to be an environment I had no knowledge of at all. And like, I knew of octopus, and I'd seen them on dives. Even I was lucky enough to see them, but really not beyond what your layperson average. We all kind of think we know octopus. So I was completely naive about the whole thing. Never met Pippa, never met Craig, and no idea about the situation. But Ellen contacted me without much explanation, and just said, "Take a look at this and see what you think. And let's start talking about it." So I had a look, and within 10 minutes of watching, I could see there was just something really unusual about what had been recorded here, and I mean, it's like straight away there was an atmosphere to the underwater footage, and just a level of access and intimacy to this creature's story that was, I don't know, just I hadn't seen anything like it before. And then I sort of continued watching, and there was this, you know, this amazing story that was fully recorded as far as I could tell. You know, I mean, there's obviously bits of her life that were not totally real, couldn't be there 24 hours a day, but it was still amazing sort of how many sort of crucial events in her life he'd been there for, and had clearly been very close and almost interacted with. And yeah, it was just incredible. The raw material was amazing, but also, and I've worked on a couple of films, not as large an amount of archive or thought process that went into this for Pippa and Craig, but I have some sense of how difficult it is to boil down that amount of sort of life story and footage into these sort of critical sort of moments, and so amazing amount of work had been done to do that, and it was clearly an amazing story. But like Pippa says, there was an element to it that wasn't quite doing it justice, which was this sort of scripted narration that, you know, and now that I know Craig and things, those were reflections of his real thoughts and feelings, but it was just, it wasn't packaged in the way that, you know, you had this footage that was so incredibly sort of real and spontaneous, and like you could see there was just, he was recording such intimate stuff, and there was a level of detachment from where Craig's voice was coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, that provided a great opportunity for us to work as a team. And like Pippa and I talked about it quite a lot first, and we sort of talked about doing an interview based approach with him, and you know, the pros and cons of that. I mean, it's actually, at the time, it was just, we decided it was going to be a bit of an experiment. You know, it's like, well, it's worth doing, you know, it's a few days, we're just going to do it and see what happens, because you can't quite tell how that's going to work until you're in it. And then, so I had one conversation with Craig over Skype, just sort of introduce myself and say, Pippa and I had sort of agreed on this as an approach or a thing to try next. And he was totally, you know, he was up for it. He's a bright man, he gets the value of that stuff, but he's not someone who naturally leans into the limelight. So, you know, I think it had to come from an outside perspective to say, you know, this is what this really needs. We cannot tell the Octopus's story without telling your story in his equally personal way. And like you know, like Pippa says, this was not a surprise to Pippa or Craig, but it was just the mechanism by which you do it. And I think because I was new, I was a stranger to this story, to these people, to the location even, it was kind of a unique new perspective to take on it. So I went out to South Africa, met Pippa. She very briefly forced me into the kelp forest for a little dive, insisting that I had to see the place at least. You know, naive's one thing, but totally ignorant is another. And then, so sort of after that, we went to Craig's house. Thought for a little while about, like, how are we going to do these interviews with such a magical world down there? Surely it's going to be like, we're going to find it so hard to cut to anything else. But then we decided that the priority was just getting Craig comfortable, and like what this story needed was just, you know, it's an incredible true story that was recorded from his perspective. It's just, it's so unlikely that you ever get this sort of thing. We need him giving his personal version of that story in the most sort of organic and authentic way. So we just committed to sitting down and doing the days. We'll sit at his kitchen table where he sits most, where he's most comfortable, where he sat and talked, you know, about, well, you know, that's where he socializes, that's where he is. And he had the ocean over to his right. And we sat down and we went back to the beginning, and we just sort of talked to her. And it took us about 3 days, and, you know, working closely with Pippa, and of course, because of the original cut of the film, I was aware of the story arc, if you like. I knew what had happened, So the challenge was to, you know, this isn't about just telling us the facts of the story. This is about finding some new interest in him. And because I didn't know him and was just filled with curiosity, and I was saying to Pippa earlier, and I've said many times, you know, it's, even if this wasn't for a film, if had I met Craig and heard about this, I would have attached myself to him and just consumed as much information about what had happened as possible, because it's fascinating. And so we just approached it like that. And then, you know, 3 days later, Pippa and I were exhausted, Craig more so. And shortly afterwards, Pippa and I went back to Bristol, and there was, you know, there's so much about that original version. You know, we couldn't have possibly got to that stage without going through the phase that Pippa and Craig did with the original version. Like, none of this process is possible without going through those different stages. But there was a bit of a process of like squinting and breaking it apart a bit and reprioritizing the film and recutting it around that conversation. And, you know, a lot of the sort of the spirit and the tone and the atmosphere and so many things that they worked so hard to create persisted and arrived back there. But there was a temporary bit where we had to go, right, let's just break it apart and be patient and try not, you know, and then put it back together again. And then, you know, that was, and there were further stages to that as well. And then Netflix got on board when we presented them with a rough cut based on this new approach. They were interested, and then that conversation began, and then, you know, other cuts.
Then there's a new set of eyes that are letting you know what's happening.
Yeah. Which was great.
Right. I'm not surprised, you know, the concept of the beginner's mind is very powerful. And if it's just a story that you're interested in, you ask questions as a beginner, and you can get extremely intimate if you don't know the person, because you'll never see them again. So I'm not surprised that that you were, you know, that you cracked that, you know, and it really feels like that. It feels seamless. It doesn't feel like it's something, a device or something you laid on top. It really feels baked in, and he speaks in a way that feels intimate, in the same way that the intimacy that he has with this animal that, you know, like the octopus also doesn't know any other humans. Like, he's also that one of its only friends, you know? So I think it worked beautifully. I really enjoyed it. I felt like all the intimacy was just exactly where it was supposed to be, but also accessible, you know, so that it wasn't like, you know, navel gazing as you described earlier, you know?
Well, it's interesting to say it, because I think like Pippa and I both went through that experience, and what was unique about this film, it had two shots at introducing that beginner's perspective, and I think that you rarely get that in such an involved way. You know, I mean, there's always new eyes on a project at various different stages, but like people went through exactly the same sort of like that magical curiosity through a key phase earlier on, which was in terms of sort of like just absorbing what had really happened and boiling down to where is the story here. And then we got another bite at that later for the sort of even Craig's perspective in. And I think, you know, Pippa and I have talked about it quite a lot. I think that's like there was a combination of those sort of new perspectives at different times that is, you know, along with a whole load of other perspectives and a team that is, while it began with Craig and a tiny camera and an octopus, it turned into an enormous collaboration. Sure. But I think kind of our perspectives on it represent something a bit bigger in terms of what it turned into.
That would be the word that I would use actually to describe the whole thing, is intimacy. And it's it was a pleasure. So tell me about, you said Pippa, you had dived in that kelp forest before. Is that something people do there? Is that pretty unusual, or like, is that a coincidence that you'd been diving in this place that seems like, you know, another planet to me? Like, is that a thing?
It's a thing. There's a pretty big freediving community in Cape Town. I must say it has exploded, and it exploded. You know, when I started diving, and I was always wearing a wetsuit. That's the big difference. Is the water's cold, so very few people.
How cold? How cold is it?
In winter it gets down to kind of 10 degrees Celsius. And then so 10 degrees Celsius. What's that in Fahrenheit, James?
I don't know. Us Americans are
I don't know.
really
I sound, that's
useless.
Rachel.
Yeah,
I have no
I'm
idea.
not sure.
That's my problem. I'll look it
I
up.
know.
It's cold. It's cold enough that your whole body aches for the first 3 minutes, and your head aches and your toes ache, and that's why we wear those black hoods. And then in summer it actually warms up to a reasonable temperature. But yeah, people are in there all the time, and they're in there with wetsuits, and I'd been diving like that for a long time before I met Craig. I'd been in there with, you know, National Geographic photographers who I thought would know what they were doing. But you know, the intimacy with which Craig understands that environment, he's fascinated by tiny little things. He's as fascinated by the copepod, which is this tiny little parasite that's attached itself to the stingray, as he is by the 4-meter stingray itself. And I think it's that kind of mind and being guided around the place by someone with that kind of curiosity and knowledge, and then an incredible ability to capture it. He's an incredible cinematographer and an incredible photographer, and he's made this his life's work. So yeah, that's what's been very special for me about getting to know the kelp forest in this way.
In a totally different way, seeing it in a totally different way.
Exactly.
So I have a bunch of questions, but I'm getting some audience questions that I would like to give to you. And I was interested anyways about location sound and sound design, and who did you work with, and how were they able to, you know, to create a 3-dimensional experience, which is like being surrounded in this incredible and unusual environment. How did you do that? And who did you work with, and how did you get them there?
We worked in a lot of interviews. We've said, you know, this film was almost made by a family. It was literally, you know, between Craig's son and his wife, and all of so many people who they've known for years, and now all of us feel like we're part of a strange octopus family together. And Barry Donnelly, our sound designer, has known Craig since he was 4 years old, and they've been running around on the beach together since they were that old. So Barry came in, and he also has an intimate knowledge of that environment. He came diving with us to capture some of the underwater sounds, and actually it's not that loud underwater. You know, there are some things. There's some things like these little animals called cracker shrimps, which make this like in the water. You never see them. I've never seen them. And then you can capture things like humpback whales singing. But for a lot of the sound, like we actually had to use our imaginations to create that underwater world. You know, the sound of an octopus picking up shells, the sounds of, you'll see some shots where you get this feeling of the kelp like creaking underwater. And what Barry did was actually collect real pieces of kelp and take them back to a studio and move them against each other. And many of the sounds that you hear were created from materials that come from the environment. He spent hours just following Craig with a boom mic while he swam, and came up for the surface when he was desperate for air, and then he did another one when he was less desperate for air, so that you can hear the difference between the two. The sound of his fin splashing on the surface. And then our composer Kevin brought a whole new level of sound, and what's amazing about Kevin is he composes incredible music. He's got an amazing sensibility, but he's also got an ability to create soundscapes, which sound like music, but they're actually just, he takes all sorts of different sounds. So Craig and his son Tom went out and recorded different kinds of kelp sounds with bits of dry and wet kelp. They rubbed the kelp together, they bashed it on a rock, they threw it in the air, whatever they could. And I think they came up with about 18 different sounds. And Kevin sat down with that and he just went wild and created these incredible, scary soundscapes underwater. Almost the entire chase sequence is created from those sounds.
Oh, so cool. The kelp soundscape. That's so cool. Let me see it. Let me just see what else people are asking just really quick. People are very interested in the sound. I'm seeing another person wants to know about recording sound underwater. So when you were filming Craig, you're not rolling sound, I guess, right? It's all created after. You don't roll sound as you're shooting.
No.
So you have to completely create that in post.
It's a decision that you make. I mean,
okay.
It depends how realistic you want to be, and I think maybe James can jump in here, but it's you have to decide. And for us, what was most important was creating the feeling and the atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that is the real challenge with sort of being underwater. They're having waterproofing of microphones. I mean, there are waterproof microphones, but like it is something. It's a whole nother level of consideration when you're filming underwater. So it's a complication way further than the considerations when recording on land. I mean, there are cameras and there were bits of footage that I remember of, like, because some of Craig's, the smaller format cameras, they have little mics on them inside. So oddly, the less professional the camera, the sort of often the sounds coming in. So there's like you're getting a version of that soundscape that the camera is picking up, and some interesting sort of sounds that provide you with ideas and guides. But getting clean sound, which is like the real sound underwater, you'd actually have to have done a dedicated hydro sound recording at every point where Craig was. And of course, like he's the guy with a small camera recording a life that he doesn't know is going to be turned into a film at that point. So as keyed in and as interested in the sound that he was, you can't get, you almost have to lie to tell the truth with underwater films a little, because it's the raw sounds, and when you're in there, you like Pippa says, you can sometimes hear the most interesting things, and particularly with people like Pippa and Craig, who have so much experience hearing those sounds themselves underwater and knowing what it feels like to be there, and that mixture of things, but actually not having had the technology to record it as purely as it actually exists. You do have to kind of rebuild it based on those sort of feelings, and I think it's like you say, it is an area where you can be quite creative with the atmospheres that you're putting into those sort of scenes. But I've never, I've done few underwater films now, and the sort of discipline and attention to detail and the sampling of the real sounds that exist in this environment that Pippa, Craig, and the sound team, the whole post-production team went into was like, it was another level. I mean, it's a commitment. And I think it's amazing that those are the questions that are popping up on your feed. It's so cool, because that level of commitment, you could almost not notice it. And like, you're loving the film, and you feel in it. But to realize that a lot of that is to do with the sound design and that version of that reality that's being brought to you it's very satisfying. But like I say, that Pippa, Craig, the whole South African team together is sort of, it's part of that. It's that level of detail that makes it as absorbing as it is.
It worked. So I'm curious about this. This is more sort of, how much do you think this was I couldn't tell or pull apart how much of this was like a scientific research versus like an emotional like therapy. And is this something that was discussed, and what were the conversations like behind that?
Yeah, I mean,
Why can't it be both? They're such a natural match.
Because you usually don't get both. I mean, I think that's one of the things that made it very special and unique, is that, you know, it's nature documentaries are a certain way, you know, and this was nothing like that. But then it was, because you're learning about animal behavior, right? So is this something that you discussed in an edit or while you were filming? What?
I mean, absolutely. We talked about it all the time, but I don't think we talked about it in that way. About is it a science film versus a personal film or a story? We're telling this story through Craig's perspective. It's completely subjective, but Craig as a person is very much grounded in science.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least very much, he's not a scientist, but he's a naturalist. So he's grounded in research and observation. And that's why the scene where he goes home and he gets onto his computer and he starts reading papers and that kind of thing was really important, because we wanted to show that, you know, he's not just making this stuff up. He's interrogating all of his ideas. And there's actually a team of scientists around him who are working with him all the time to figure things out with regards to all kinds of animals in the forest. And one of those scientists is, her name is Professor Jennifer Mather, and she is an octopus psychologist. And yeah, so
who are her patients? How does that work? That's insane.
Isn't that, well, her main patient, I guess, was a deceased, very special little octopus, who she couldn't help too much, but she could help us to understand her world. And we knew that was important, because this film, you know, it takes you into the mind of quite an unusual human being, but it's also an opportunity to go into the mind of a very unusual creature. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Mather flew out to South Africa. So she's a human psychologist who also specializes in cephalopod science. And she's, wow. I mean, I know. So the fact that someone like that existed and that we found her, you know, in the early phases of making the film was miraculous. And we went through every single scene with her, and she talked us through things. And sometimes Craig and her agreed, and sometimes they didn't. Most of the time they did, but it didn't really matter, because there's some things that, you know, and that's the truth about science. There's some things you can say for certain, and others you can never really be sure. But she did give us incredible insights into what it might be like to be inside the mind of an octopus. And one of the first things she said is, an octopus's whole world is about the tension between fear and curiosity. Mm-hmm. You know, and then you start to get a sense of the character of this creature that you're telling a story about. She said things like, you know, an octopus that gets to the end of its life is a complete genius, because this is a snail that's traded its shell for a really big brain. Mm-hmm. When that happens, what kind of creature do you get? Mm-hmm. You know, and she said things like, the sharks are as important to the octopus as the octopus is to the shark for food, because without the shark, the octopus would never have developed all of these ingenious ways of protecting itself underwater. Mm-hmm.
God, you can learn a lot from them. You really can. I mean, that is a wonderful philosophy of life, is like to push yourself, you know. It's like what filmmakers do too, which is your curiosity puts you in places that you maybe shouldn't be, or you're jumping into a freezing cold ocean, which personally is like my biggest fear. So it's a very beautiful metaphor, but also it's not a metaphor. That's kind of what it is. It's also real. So I felt, I assume that there is a conservation philosophy, or that's part of, it's baked into Craig and it's baked into you, but it doesn't feel heavy-handed at all. It doesn't. The film is not about that at all, but it's just part of it. It's part of its DNA. Did you guys talk about that also? Was that something? Why did you make that decision? Why did you make that decision to be so sort of light touch on that?
You go, James.
I mean,
Or
I'd
maybe
say-
you didn't. I don't know. This is just my observation.
It was absolutely it was very intentional.
No, I think it formed a huge part of our conversations throughout, but particularly in the later stages of the edit in Bristol. I mean, I think part of it, and I didn't have an outside. This was, by that point, there were several key players to this, of which Pippa and I were two, and it was the debate that was ongoing actually, and I think Pippa and I saw, we saw eye to eye. I mean, actually, ultimately, we all sort of reached the same conclusion, which was good, and it was a healthy debate. I mean, not to suggest I had any outsized impact on that decision, but and also not to suggest I'm not an environmentalist, because I am. It's not like I don't care about the environment. Of course I do. But I was, in part because of my brief window into it, I was very focused on the personal story that we had, and felt very strongly. And as Pippa and I did going through that second edit, that just was like, what we have here is a very unique personal relationship with an animal that has huge opportunity to connect people to some bigger ideas and themes, and that any sort of imposition of a broader environmental message, just like every time we considered it, it just felt like that we're breaking what we have in a way. Like, that feels sort of manipulative. Like we've got this really pure, honest, amazing, once in a lifetime interspecies relationship. We're not now just going to use this as a, well, don't we live in a time where you have to have an environmental message with that? And we just kind of felt, well, no, actually, like we're doing the thing we're doing for any movement that chooses to associate with this is right here in depicting this relationship in the most full way that we can. And yeah, Pippa and I, like, we talked a lot about it, and like we felt equally conflicted at times. It's easy to say with a degree of certainty now, but we felt quite conflicted about it, because we knew that, well, we're offering the level of emotional engagement that it's rare in films, and therefore there is a real opportunity. And will we be forever criticized for not taking that opportunity? And will we feel bad about it ourselves? And like, with lots of healthy sort of debate around it, because it's not a black and white situation. So there's lots of different versions of things. But I think, yeah, Pippa, you speak to that. I mean, I think
I think there were many things James and I did not agree on, but this was one thing we were like totally on the same page, and I'm glad about that, because to keep your confidence, when you know that, as James said, we had an emotional story. It was an opportunity to bring in a more issue-based conservation story, or conservation message, but actually, I mean, from my point of view, as someone who's worked specifically in the conservation journalism world for a long time before I started on this project, I felt like we really had an opportunity here to speak to an audience and engage viewers about the natural world, and people who would not normally engage with a nature film.
Right.
And I was really excited about that, because I'd grown a little bit frustrated with speaking to the choir in my years in conservation.
Sure.
And then there is a conservation message, and exactly as the film stands, which is about where do human beings fit in on planet Earth, and how do we relate to this multitude of life forms that we are surrounded by. And since the beginning of time, we've had an integral relationship with nature, with all the creatures that make up nature, and we are a part of nature. And somehow we've not all of us, but there's been some sort of disconnect, and that disconnect has had devastating consequences for our planet, and will have devastating consequences for all of the human beings that come after us, and all of the animals that come after us, unless we start to reevaluate what that relationship is and how it works.
Well, I think honestly, it was one of the most brilliant conservation films for me. It worked. It worked to have the intimate story. It really did. It makes you care very deeply about the kelp forest, which I hadn't heard of or thought about before. It's like something I would fight for now. So I think that decision was totally valid. I think we've run out of time, but I wanted to thank Netflix and also the Woodstock Film Festival for bringing us together. I want to congratulate you two on your nomination and getting so many eyeballs.
Did we lose Rachel at a key moment? We're now the hosts. We're now the hosts.
We're now the hosts.
Rachel. We got Rachel Grady coming up.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Anyways, my message was thank you very much. Thanks so much for making this film. I really loved it. It's very special, and enjoy sharing it with people.
But thank you for making time to speak to us.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Okay. Bye, guys.
Really nice to talk to you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.